Good morning. As we just sung about, Jesus of Nazareth was put on trial almost 2,000 years ago. And one thing we see in scriptures is that the Jewish and Roman trials both had gross procedural transgressions and ultimately resulted in the greatest miscarriage of justice in the history of the world. Today I'm going to show you how Jesus' trials went against multiple Jewish and Roman laws. Now in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, the Apostle Paul asked the Corinthians to indulge him in a little foolishness. And I'm asking you to do the same with me today, albeit a different kind of foolishness. The way that I'm going to present this information is going to be a little bit unorthodox. It's not going to be the way that I typically present information. It's going to have a little bit of a dramatic flair. And the reason for that is not to entertain or to be irreverent, but the purpose of doing that in that fashion is twofold. For one, to make this information memorable so that you can remember this and keep it in your memory. But most of all, it's to draw the due attention and to invoke the right kind of emotion around the injustice that Jesus faced. And as part of this, what I'm going to be doing this morning, I want you to be part of this. I'd like you to consider yourselves as part of the jury. The jury that is overseeing this appeal of the sentence of Jesus of Nazareth, that he was pronounced guilty in some ways by both the Jews and Pontius Pilate. And so you as the jury are going to be hearing this appeal case, and we are going to, this morning, we are going to exonerate the Son of God, exonerate Jesus of Nazareth due to the evidence from his own trials and how his trials were held. So I'd like first to look at the Jewish trial, and if you would turn over to Mark chapter 14. We're going to be turning around the Gospels this morning. In Mark chapter 14 we have our first piece of evidence in verses 53 and 54. It says, "They led away Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and scribes gathered together. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire." We're going to stop right there because, though never explicitly stated in the Gospels, the fact that Jesus was arrested at night and immediately taken to the residence of the high priest, coupled with the accounts that Peter and the officers were sitting by a fire, the conclusion must be drawn that Jesus' Jewish trial was held at night. And this is in direct contradiction to a document that outlines the procedures of Jewish court. I'd like to present to you the Mishnah Sanhedrin, chapter 4 and verse 1. We're going to be looking at this text a lot this morning, and some other Jewish texts as well. Now, the Mishnah Sanhedrin was put together at about 200 AD, but it contains in it traditions that are much older, traditions that would have been in place during the time that this trial took place. In Mishnah Sanhedrin, chapter 4 and verse 1, it says, "Cases concerning capital law," that is, crimes that were deemed worthy of death. "Cases concerning capital law must be judged during the daytime, and the verdict may also be reached only in the daytime. However, if the verdict is guilty, it may not be concluded until the following day." We'll talk about that last line later. But the Jews were breaking their own procedural law by having this trial at night. It was only supposed to be during the day. But they were also breaking this law in other ways. Also part of the Mishnah Sanhedrin, chapter 4 and verse 1. And this verse 1 is kind of a long section, and so there are a lot of things said in it. But it also says, therefore trials may not be held on the eve of the Sabbath or on the eve of a festival. Now, you on the jury, I want you to understand that Jesus was arrested after the observance of the Passover, and that the Jews were right in the middle of observing the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. John, as we read a moment ago in John 19, it was the day of preparation for the Passover, talking about the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And so they were during a festival, and it said trials may not be held on the eve of the Sabbath or the eve of a festival. And that's exactly when this was held, during the eve of a festival. So proper procedure was not followed for this trial. Here is another piece of evidence. Turn over to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. And we'll start reading in verse 63. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him. And they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, prophesy, who is the one who hit you? And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. So here in the historical account of Jesus' trial, we are told that Jesus himself is being beaten and mocked before he is ever sentenced. This goes against the law of Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, Deuteronomy 25, starting in verse 1, it says, if there is a dispute between men and they go to the court and the judges decide their case and they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked, then it shall be, if the wicked man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make him lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of stripes according to his guilt. He may beat him 40 times, but no more, so that he does not beat him with many more stripes than these, and your brother is not degraded in your eyes. Here in the law of Moses, this case law says, if there is a dispute between brethren, and there is a righteous man and a wicked man, judges are to hear this case, and they are to determine guilt. And only after they determine guilt can a man be beaten for his crimes. And even after guilt is determined, he is not to be beaten in such a way that he is degraded before his brethren. And yet Jesus, even before he is sentenced, even before he is pronounced guilty by the Sanhedrin, he's already being beaten and mocked and spit upon and degraded. Let's look at another piece of evidence. In Mark chapter 14, if you'll turn over there, and verse 55. Mark 14 and verse 55, it says, now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any. However, we come back to the Mishnah Sanhedrin chapter 4, verse 1, and it says, in capital cases, all the council that is hearing this case, all judges, all are to argue for acquittal. That is, all are to argue that this man is innocent. But not all are to argue for conviction. The purpose of that law was to say, when a man's life is on the line, he needs to be given the fairest shake possible. And every single judge is supposed to be unbiased. And they are all to try to make arguments to not put him to death, to release him. But in capital cases, all could not make the argument for his death. And yet, what do you see in Jesus' own trial? That the chief priests and the whole council, they are trying to obtain testimony to put him to death. They are all arguing for conviction. And that is not the way that it was supposed to go. Also in Mark 14, continue reading with me in verse 56. It says, "For many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony was not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands.' Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent." And so we see that the Sanhedrin, the council, they are trying to obtain testimony, but not just any kind of testimony, false testimony. They're looking for false witnesses. In the law of Moses, in Deuteronomy chapter 19, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please look at this text. Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 15. It says there, "A single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of an iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. If a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both the men who have the dispute shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who will be in office in those days. The judges shall investigate thoroughly, and if a witness is false, if the witness is a false witness, and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he had intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you." What it says in the law of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 19 is that there shouldn't be false witnesses. That rather, on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a trial is to be confirmed, that a matter is to be confirmed. And yet Jesus did not have witnesses that were agreeing together. Instead, he had false witnesses who were giving inconsistent testimony. And the judges should have heard that. And the judges should have upheld justice. And it says, if a witness is found to be a false witness, then whatever they were conspiring to do against the person they were witnessing against, that should happen to them. What should have happened to these witnesses? They should have been put to death, because that's exactly what they were trying to get to happen to Jesus. They were testifying falsely to get him to be put to death. We also have this statement in the Mishnah Sanhedrin, chapter 5 and verse 5. It says, when witnesses are giving testimony, if the witnesses contradict each other, their testimony is null. The way that we would argue this in court today, their testimony is inadmissible. Don't listen to it. It doesn't exist. And yet we see here that in Mark 14, these inconsistent witnesses were being listened to. They weren't being punished. And they were trying to get this testimony to stick. Turn over to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26 and verse 63. After these false witnesses come up, in verse 62 it says, the high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" Verse 63, but Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They answered, he deserves death. And so they sentenced him to death on that same trial, during that same trial. Now Luke tells us that the trial goes on throughout the night, and it's in the morning that they convene together and pass the sentence. But it's in that same trial, that same period of time. Coming back to the Mishnah Sanhedrin chapter 4 and verse 1, it says, a favorable verdict may be pronounced the same day. That is, if they had pronounced Jesus innocent, they could have given that on the same day. But it says a verdict of guilty must be postponed until the following day. From what I understand, the reasoning behind this law is that if you're going to be sentencing a man to death, you need to take some time to sleep on it, so to speak. You need to take some time to make sure that you're making the right decision. But they did not postpone until the following day. Rather, they had the trial at night, which they weren't supposed to do, on the eve of a festival, which they weren't supposed to do, and they rendered a guilty verdict on the same day, which they were not supposed to do. The purpose of these laws were to make sure that justice and mercy were properly being administered, but no such procedure was observed during the trial of Jesus. And they handed down the verdict, Jesus of Nazareth was guilty of blasphemy and deserving of death. But that does not end the trial of Jesus. Then they bring him to the Romans. They bring him to Pontius Pilate. In Matthew 26 and verses 65 and 66, as we just read, I will read it again. Then the high priest tore his robes and he said, he has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They answered, he deserves death. Now, one thing I did not mention because I could not find supporting text behind it. But from what I understand from a legal perspective, he was on trial for things that he had already done. He was on trial for whatever those false witnesses were testifying against him. He was not on trial for whatever he said during the trial. And so for them to pronounce him guilty based on what he said was also not the right procedure. They say, what further need do we have of witnesses? Well, they needed those 2 or 3 witnesses to confirm whatever he was on trial for. And so they ruined it in that way as well. But they condemned him to death for blasphemy. But in Luke 23, starting in verse 1, it says, then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. So Pilate asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, it is as you say. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they kept on insisting, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. There's a problem with that. They had condemned him to death for blasphemy. But now they are going to Pontius Pilate and they are changing the charges. They did not find him guilty of misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. They did not find him guilty of sedition and treason and insurrection. They found him guilty of blasphemy. And yet they take him to this higher court and they've changed the charges against him. Does that seem right to you? However, we're going to proceed to look at this trial regarding the charges brought by the Jews. Surely the Roman governor is going to observe proper procedure during the trial, right? Unfortunately, that is not the case. John 18. In John 18, in verse 28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. And they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." But here's a problem. The chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees delivered Jesus over to Pilate, and they did level accusations against him, but legally speaking, they were not his accusers. Consider the case of Paul v. the Jewish people in Acts chapter 25, that most excellent Festus presides over. In this letter that he has written to Caesar in Acts chapter 25 and verse 15, he says, "And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges." Most excellent Festus testifies of Roman procedure that a sentence of condemnation cannot be passed until there is a proper trial, until the accused meets his accusers face to face and is given an opportunity to make a defense against those charges. No such opportunity was afforded to Jesus in his legal proceedings. His accusers instead formed a mob to hurl accusations against him as Pilate is judging and looking over him. But there is no orderly way for Jesus to make a defense. No proper trial is being held in Jerusalem as Pontius Pilate is overseeing this. In Luke chapter 23, in verse 15, we'll actually start in verse 13. Luke 23, starting in verse 13. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore, I will punish him and release him." Now we see here, as well as John 18, that Jesus was scourged before Pilate handed down sentence. And many have thought that the Romans have the right to do whatever they wanted to non-Roman citizens. But that is not the case. Here we have a document called digest. And that is a weird word for us in English, but this is a collection of Roman law written by Roman jurists. People who made and interpreted Roman law. This particular person is Marcion, who says this, and it says, "No one shall be tortured unless the gravity of the crime is such as to affect the public welfare." They have to have committed a crime and have been found guilty of it. And that crime was to have been so grave that it affected the public welfare. And yet Pilate says, "I have found no guilt in him. But I'm going to punish him anyway. I'm going to scourge him," which, by the way, killed people. People died from scourging all the time. It was a horrible form of torture. And Pilate goes directly against Roman law. Even non-Romans were not allowed to be tortured unless they had committed crimes that had affected public welfare. Turn over to Mark 15. Mark 15. Starting in verse 6. This is speaking of Pilate. It says, "Now at the feast he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested. The man named Barabbas had been in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the insurrection. The crowd went up and began asking him to do as he had been accustomed to do for them. Pilate answered them, saying, 'Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?' For he was aware that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. Answering again, Pilate said to them, 'Then what shall I do with him whom you call the king of the Jews?' They shouted back, 'Crucify him!' But Pilate said to them, 'Why? What evil has he done?' But they shouted all the more, 'Crucify him!' Wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified." Pontius Pilate, our Roman governor, stands condemned by 3 different sources. Seneca, who wrote De Ira, chapter 1, section 16, "A judge should not yield to the clamor of the people." Cicero in Pro Cluentio 146 says, "Justice is not subject to public opinion or to fear of the crowd." And Tacitus in his Annals in chapter 15 and verse 20 says, "The governor's duty is to administer justice, not to satisfy the desires of the mob." There's no justification for what Pontius Pilate did. Even if he feared some kind of uprising and Caesar becoming upset, the law of the Romans stood on his side, that he should have administered justice instead of caving in to the demands of unjust Jews. But he gave in. He gave in to the fear of the crowd, the desires of the mob, the clamor of the people. He yielded and did not administer true justice. Over in John 19, we read some of this a moment ago. But in John 19, starting in verse 1, Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and to give him slaps in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." He then goes over to verse 16, where it says, "So then he handed him over to them to be crucified." In Digest 48.1.1, section 1, verse 1, I guess you could say, a man by the name of Ulpian says, "It is better for the guilty to go unpunished than for the innocent to be condemned." This is the logic that is behind our justice system as well. Our justice system, as well as, from what I understand, the Romans and even the Jewish justice system, considered you innocent until proven guilty. And it is this reason, this logic that is behind it. It is better for the guilty to go unpunished than for the innocent to be condemned. And then later on, in chapter 50, section 17, verse 1, it says, Ulpian says, there is no crime and no punishment without law. Well, we know in the case of Jesus, the guilty did go unpunished. Barabbas was set free. But also, the innocent was condemned. And yet we see in this Roman law, it says there's no crime and no punishment without law. That is to say, if you have not broken a law, then you have not committed a crime and you are not deserving of punishment. And as obvious as that sounds, here it is explicitly stating, and Jesus had broken no law. Not of the Jews, not of the Romans, not of God. There was no crime. There should have been no punishment. Let me just say, before I conclude here, there are other things that we could have brought up. For the sake of time, we're not going to bring up possibly everything that could have been said. Every aspect of Roman and Jewish law that could have been researched. But in the time that we have had today, we have made a sufficient case, a wide open, slam dunk case. And so we need to recognize what the verdict should have been. The court finds Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, the Son of God, not guilty. That's what the verdict should have been. But we know that's not how it went. Jesus had to die. Yes, it was a miscarriage of justice, and yes, it was a wicked, lawless, awful act. But the beauty of the gospel is that in this monstrously unjust act, we received mercy and grace. The innocent was condemned to die so that the guilty could be set free. It was a miscarriage of justice, but it was one that he chose to be a part of. Jesus told his disciples in the garden before he was arrested and while he was being arrested. He said, "Do you not know that I could call 12 legions of angels and my Father would send them to me?" Jesus at any time could have mounted a defense. He could have shown his true power. As they were mocking him and saying, "If you are the Christ, come down from the cross," he could have come down. And his wounds could have been instantaneously healed. And he could have revealed his true glory and his true power to them. But he didn't do that. He died a cruel, torturous, unjust death for us. He was innocent. He was the perfect Lamb of God who died for our sins, who died for your sins. And so, having seen what we have seen today, let us be grateful for Jesus, that he was willing to go through that horrible atrocity for our sakes. And this morning, we're about to sing an invitation song. You have a choice about what you're going to do with that. Jesus stood in the halls of Pilate without any friends, without anyone to defend him. But you can be a friend of Jesus. Jesus said, "You are my friends if you do what I say, if you keep my commandments." Jesus said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." If you give your life to Jesus, you can be faithful to him, be his friend, be subservient to him. And he will give you eternal life. He will give you that forgiveness of sins that he died for. So if you need to put on Christ in baptism, you have an opportunity to do so. And if you don't know how to get that process started, still come forward, because we have an opportunity to help you and to guide you through that using the scriptures to show you what you must do to be saved. If you are a Christian and perhaps you have not been living faithfully to Jesus, remember all that he suffered for your sake. Remember his sacrifice as we did earlier this morning with the Lord's Supper, and don't let that be in vain. If you have any need this morning, won't you come while we stand and sing?